This little 2-year-old girl stood up, didn't look at her mom, mind you, turned and walked over to the far corner wall and stood facing the wall. Recently, I came across a word that I have never seen before. The word is habituation. Have you ever heard of it? Neither have I. Denial promises protection, but it delivers loneliness. 16 years of being in denial, it lengthened my pain. Are you facing God? One day I was at an important meeting, wearing a nice pair of brown slacks that I had, outgrown. I got up from the conference table to make copies of some important papers when the papers fell out of my hands. I foolishly bent over to pick them up and a really loud ripping noise filled the room. My client literally jumped in their chair. I was extremely embarrassed as the reality of my being overweight was immediately brought to light. Have you ever ignored an issue in your life that you knew was a problem, but you simply disregarded it, thinking maybe it'll just go away or possibly you'll deal with it later? We call this behavior denial, and depending on the issue, it can have major consequences that eventually hurt me and, like a hand grenade going off, cause collateral damage to the people I love. Today, I'm going to be talking about 6 negative effects of denial and what happens when I ignore the very voice of God in my life. Are you willing to join me and evaluate your own life? Are you brave enough to turn the mirror toward yourself and allow God to show you where positive change is possible? I'm Eric Hutchinson, and this is the If Nothing Changes podcast. Let's begin the discussion. So, hey guys, today I am changing things up a bit. Instead of having a guest on my show, I'm going to be talking about a topic that I recently taught on at the Celebrate Recovery meeting in Rogers, Arkansas at Fellowship Bible Church. The teaching was on denial, and it's based upon the Celebrate Recovery Principle 1 and the Alcoholics Anonymous Step 1. The denial acrostic that I'm going to use is directly from the Celebrate Recovery materials, and I want to make sure that I give them credit as I will be making reference to their material. The illustrations are mine, but the acrostic outline is their content. Before we get started, let me ask you a question. Are you facing God? I tell you what, let's come back to that question in a moment, and let me tell you a true story. Recently, my niece and her family visited my house. She has a 9-month-old baby boy named Everett and a cute little baby girl named Lauren, who is 2 years old. I had forgotten how much energy these little creatures we call kids can generate, and I also had forgotten how much energy is needed to take care of these creatures. If you have a little creature from 0 to 5 years old, you have my utmost respect. Anyway, we are all sitting in the living room talking and watching the kids play when Lauren, the 2-year-old girl, did something that she wasn't supposed to do. Her mother, my niece, in a kind but stern voice, asked her to stop doing what she was doing. This little 2-year-old girl stood up, didn't look at her mom, mind you, turned and walked over to the far corner wall and stood facing the wall. I thought to myself, wow, Lauren was putting herself in time out. I asked my niece if she had taught her to put herself in time out when she was in trouble. My niece said, oh no, she's just ignoring me. I thought, oh, and isn't it interesting that at 2 years old, this little girl had mastered the art of denial? You see, Webster Dictionary defines denial as the act of refusing to admit the truth or reality of something. Let me read that again. The act of refusing to admit the truth or reality of something. You see, little Lauren had turned her back on us, and even though we were in the same room as her, she was pretending that we weren't even there. She was denying our very presence in the room. I thought of Adam and Eve in the garden after they had sinned. They tried to hide from God. They were denying the very presence of God in their lives. Then I thought of Jonah. When God asked him to go to Nineveh and deliver a message to the people, he turned his back on God and went the opposite direction. I wonder, have you ever tried to hide from God? Have you ever tried to run from God? Then I thought of myself prior to recovery. How many times had God convicted me of my pornography addiction, of holding bitterness against my ex-wife, or for overeating? I simply turned my back on God and pretended that He wasn't even there. Then, in 2010, I started working the process of recovery, the process of change in my life. Do you want to know what I learned? I learned that facing God breaks my denial and brings healing to my life. Today, I want to talk about Celebrate Recovery's Principle 1 and Alcoholics Anonymous Step 1. Now, before you shut off this podcast because you feel that recovery doesn't apply to you because you're not addicted to anything, let me remind you that we are all addicted to sin. Romans 3:23 says, we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We all have hurts, bad habits, and character defects that we would like to change in our lives. Principle 1 says, realize I am not God. I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing and that my life is unmanageable. Step 1 from AA says, we admitted that we were powerless over our addictions and compulsive behaviors and that our lives had become unmanageable. As you look at your life, are there any negative patterns that you see yourself repeating? It could be anger. It could be sarcasm. It could be overeating. It might even be codependency or low self-esteem. It could be a past hurt that you just can't let go of. If I'm not dealing with something negative in my life and it continues to be a repeating problem, that's denial, and this episode is for you. Today, I'm going to be talking about 6 negative effects of denial and what happens when I ignore God in my life. I'm going to do this by going through the Celebrate Recovery's denial acrostic. Recently, I came across a word that I have never seen before. The word is habituation. Have you ever heard of it? Neither have I. Habituation is what happens when I'm exposed to something for a long period of time, but I don't act upon it. I ignore it. My mind learns to tune it out. Have you ever known anyone who lives close to some train tracks or a noisy highway, and you thought, how could they sleep at night? You see, their mind has become numb to the noise and they don't hear it. Have you ever known anyone who continually sleeps through their alarm in the morning? When that person ignores the alarm, eventually it becomes numb to their brain and they don't hear the noise. I want to read you a definition of Christian habituation. Habituation is when conviction fades, not because God stopped talking, but because I stopped listening. Let me read that to you again. Habituation is when conviction fades, not because God stopped talking, but because I stopped listening. I stopped responding to the very voice of God in my life, which brings me to the first letter in our denial acrostic, which is D, which stands for it disables my feelings. In my own addiction, I would stuff those feelings of guilt and shame again and again, ignoring God's conviction and not acting upon it. This constricted the very voice of God in my life, and I became numb. However, when I stepped out of denial, I turned and I faced God, which finally broke the denial and brought healing to my life. I could finally hear the voice of God in my life again. 2 Peter 2:19 says, they promise them freedom while they themselves are slaves of depravity. For people are slaves to whatever has mastered them. I was a slave to pornography, and it disabled my feelings as I ignored the voice of God in my life. It also wore me out, which brings me to the second acrostic letter of denial, which is E, which stands for energy lost. Galatians 5:1 says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." You see, God desires for me to be free from my hurts, habits, and hang-ups. However, when I live in denial about my issues, those same issues imprison me and slowly suck the energy right out of me. Have you ever checked your phone to see how many applications are left open and running in the background? You see, whenever you are in an application on your smartphone and then get out of that application, most of the time, it doesn't close that application automatically. It leaves it running in the background, and you have to actually close those applications manually. So the problem is that our phone batteries don't last very long. And the more applications that are open in the background, the quicker your battery is drained. Applications like GPS, social media, mapping, and location services really suck the energy right out of your phone's battery, just like anxiety, worry, anger, resentment, bitterness, shame, guilt, and unforgiveness suck the energy right out of my life. When I stay in denial, it slowly but surely drains the energy right out of me. I have to keep up with all the lies that I've been telling others about my secrets. It keeps me stuffing those feelings of guilt and shame. It's exhausting and it wears me out. God wants me to live in freedom. You know, the basic test of freedom is not what I'm free to do, but what I'm free not to do. When I stepped out of denial and faced God about my issues, I realized that I am free not to lust and look at pornography. I am free not to be bitter and angry at my divorce. I am free not to overeat. And I'm finally free to be completely honest with my wife and my family. When I become free from denial, all that energy that I use to maintain my denial can now be used to focus on God's truth for my life, and it causes me to grow. Which brings me to the next letter in our denial acrostic, which is N, which stands for it negates my growth. Psalms 107:14 says, "He brought them out of darkness, utter darkness, and broke away their chains." Denial causes darkness in my life, and it leads me into more addiction, hurt, and pain in my life. Have you ever seen a flower that has been deprived of light? What happens whenever it's in the dark? The leaves start to fall off and it starts to wither. But what happens whenever that same plant is moved into a sunny window? It starts to grow again and thrive. What a difference sunlight makes to that plant, and what a difference Jesus Christ can make in my life. When I'm in denial, I turn away from God and step out of the light. I step out of fellowship with God into a dark place. My spiritual life withers. However, when I step out of denial, out of darkness, and face God, it brings my denial and my spiritual life starts to flourish. Many refer to church and God to being like a hospital. You know, a place where people go who are sick and need help. I get that. But what happens when a person goes to the hospital and they get better? They leave, don't they? I prefer to compare church and fellowship with God to a greenhouse. A greenhouse is a place where plants can thrive. It gives those plants a place where they can experience the best possible conditions for growth. There is constant sunlight. Water mist continues to spray on the plants, giving them hydration, and a temperature in the greenhouse remains constant, shielding them from the storms and bad weather outside the greenhouse. That's what a relationship with Jesus Christ does in my life. When I face God, it breaks my denial and allows maximum growth in my life. However, if I continue in my denial, it not only negates my growth, but it isolates me from God, which brings me to the next acrostic letter, which is I, which stands for isolates me from God. Now, I want to be clear. When I say denial isolates me from God, I don't mean that God goes away. Deuteronomy 31:8 says that God will never leave me nor forsake me. But I can turn my back on God and ignore him. Just like Adam and Eve hid from God, I can try and run from God. You see, denial is actually self-inflicted darkness. I can't see what I won't look at. What a terrible power that I have to be able to deny the presence of God, even though he's right there. Remember, in the story of Jonah, God asked Jonah to go to Nineveh and to deliver a message to the people. Jonah didn't want to go, so he turned his back on God and he went in the opposite direction. Jonah tried to run from God and found himself in the belly of a gigantic fish. He was all alone. Or was he? You see, when I turn my back on God, it feels like I'm all alone in the darkness. But all I have to do is turn back towards him. He's right there. He never left. Jonah repented and he finally obeyed what God was asking him to do in his life. And that's exactly what I need to do to break the denial in my life. Denial not only isolates me from God, but it also alienates me from other people, which brings me to the next acrostic letter, which is A, which stands for it alienates me from others. Ephesians 4:25 says, therefore, each of you must put off falsehood, which is basically lies, and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. You see, denial promises protection, but it delivers loneliness. Let me say that again. Denial promises protection, but it delivers loneliness. When I'm in denial, I'm living a lie, and I don't want others to see that lie in my life. So I become separated from others, and many times it's the people that I love the most. When I was in my own addiction, I avoided closeness with my wife and family to avoid the possibility that they would know something was wrong. I didn't want to go to church functions because I felt guilty and shameful. However, the more I isolated myself, the more tempted I became. You see, there is power in community. That's why fellowship with other Christians is so important. When I'm alone, I become weak emotionally and vulnerable. The enemy knows that when I'm alone, keeping my secrets, I am at highest risk for temptation and failure. The verse I quoted in Ephesians 4:25 says, stop lying to each other. Tell the truth. There is a saying that we have in recovery that says we're only as sick as our secrets. While facing God breaks my denial, facing others breaks alienation in my life. As I bring others into my recovery, they become my accountability and I become stronger in my walk with Jesus. Otherwise, I remain stuck in my denial for a long time, which brings me to the last letter in our denial acrostic, which is L, which stands for it lengthens my pain. On September 12th, 1994 is when my ex-wife discovered my addiction and my life came crumbling down. Now, I had moments of repentance and moments of following Jesus, but I would return back to my sin and to my addiction and to my hurts and habits over and over again. It wasn't until I came to a recovery process on September 10th, 2010, that I totally surrendered to Jesus Christ. I totally faced God. 16 years from 94 to 2010 of ignoring God. 16 years of being in denial. It lengthened my pain. Psalms 32, 2-5 says, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. You see, concealment always costs more than confession. As I turn and face God and confess to God that I am powerless and that I need His help, it breaks my denial and brings healing to my life. Do you feel like that you are all alone in your struggle? Who moved? You or God? Let me ask you that same question that I asked you at the beginning of the episode. Are you facing God? Has God been speaking to you, but His voice seems distant and faint? Maybe you've been experiencing habituation, where God has been talking, but you haven't been listening. You haven't been responding to His voice. Maybe you need to turn and face God and experience His presence in your life. There's a Hebrew word in the Bible pronounced panim. It's often translated as presence in the English Bible. For instance, in Jonah 1:3, when it talks about Jonah's story, it says Jonah ran away from the panim of the Lord, the presence of the Lord. But if you look up what panim literally means in Hebrew, it means face. Jonah ran from the panim, the face of the Lord. Are you facing God? Are you listening, or are you in denial about something? I want to encourage you to turn and face God in your life. Listen to His voice and respond to Him. Maybe that looks like confession to someone that you trust. Maybe it looks like getting back into community with other Christians. Hey, if you are listening today, I want you to know that Jesus Christ stands at the door and knocks at the door of your heart. He's waiting for you to answer. He can change your life. However, if nothing changes, nothing changes. See you next time.